Okay, so we've got all our assets compiled in one Photoshop document that we've just recently worked on. And now we're going to take those layers and masked elements. We're going to bring all of that information into Adobe After Effects, and we're going to manipulate each of those layers and animate those layers individually. So we're looking at Adobe After Effects here, and this is what we'll be presented with when we open up the application. If not, you'll want to go to File, New, create a new project. Let's start off by saving the document, and we'll save as, and I'm going to call it, first of all I'm going to go to my folder on the desktop where my assets are, and I'm going to save it in that same folder which I've called Let's Animate Stuff, and I might call it just Animation for now. Click Save, and we'll just have a quick look at the desktop. Now, file management and resource management is really important in After Effects. Similarly to something like InDesign, After Effects files or the assets in After Effects files are linked rather than embedded. So making sure that you keep all your files working together, housed together, so that that linkage relationship remains intact is really important. And you can get into some kind of sticky situations if you lose or break that linkage relationship. So I always want to make sure that I keep my animation AEP file, which is my After Effects file, related to any assets that I have. And at the moment, well, I haven't related anything, but I'm shortly going to relate this PSD file called asset for animation. And let's do that right now. Let's import our PSD. So I'm going to File, Import, File. And I'm going to find our PSD that we created. And I'm going to import it as a composition in this instance. So change it from import as footage to import composition and retain the layer styles. Make sure these two options are unchecked. Go to open. Funnily enough, we get asked the same options in a separate dialog box here. We want to just make sure retain layer styles is selected, and that not that we have any at the moment, but any of our layer styles are also editable. We'll click OK. Right, over here in our project pane, you can see that our PSD has been imported as a composition, and you can see this little picture icon is a composition, and then we've got a folder for the assets in that PSD, and the assets in this case are layers. So the fishes that we created, the planet, the sky, and there was also a background in there. Super good. Before we go on, we might just have a quick look around. I am using the Workspace Animation Workspace, Window Workspace Animation Workspace. And I find that often the most uncluttered kind of space to work in. There's plenty that you could test out. And in this case, I've also removed a bunch of panels that will be over in this right hand side here, just to kind of clean up my interface while I'm doing the screencast. One thing that kind of is apparent when we look at the interface of After Effects is that it is a very cluttered workspace with lots of very small kind of icons and menu items and panels. It can be a little bit overwhelming, and what I'll get you to do is just to focus on the things that we need to use at the moment. And as we kind of build up our kind of knowledge of the application, we'll start branching out to different kind of areas and start working out what some of the little bits and pieces do for us. Let's get started doing some animation, and as we work on the animation, we can kind of start to discover what some of the different panels are and how they kind of work. If I go over to our project panel here and look at our composition in the project panel essentially is our library of assets, and we can include lots of different types of assets into After Effects, anything from PSTs, which we've got here, Illustrator files, sound files and video files, and some 3D assets as well. I'm going to double click on our composition, and compositions are kind of like the workspaces for all of our animations. You can see when I double clicked on that, it's loaded up our PSD in our kind of our picture viewer over here, and it's also showing us the layer stack. So this is, I suppose, the layers in our Photoshop file, corresponds with the layers in our Photoshop file. Over on the left-hand side of what we call the timeline. This is our timeline panel. And over here is actually time. And you can see that we've actually got seconds running along here. And this is our current time indicator. And if we scrub that along the timeline, we're kind of moving forward and backwards in time. At the moment, you won't see anything occur because we haven't created any animation. Now, just to start with, I don't want to make such a long animation. We've got an animation going all the way up to 1 minute there. And I think that that's occurred, or been given that length of time, because that was the previous previous animation that I made. Anyway, to change that, we need to change our composition settings. So the settings of this composition here. So if I make sure it's selected and go to composition and go to composition settings. Now there's a bunch of stuff in here that we can alter. You can see that we've got our size and width, but down here is our duration, and we want to make that only 10 seconds. So I'm going to go in and change that. Now, the animation length that your composition was created with might be different, but whatever it was, let's change it to 10 seconds. We can see in here we've got our dimensions. We've also got a frame rate here. Now the frame rate is how many frames play per second, so it's frames per second. And in this instance, I think 25 is a good frame rate. Yeah, so change that to 25. Click OK. So now you can see that the increments in our timeline go up to 10 seconds. So that's good. Just adjusting my workspace a little bit. You can see that just like other apps, if I kind of hover around those kind of seams, I can modify the panels to make it a bit more comfortable. All right, let's start let's start some animation. Let's start with the background. And we want to move the background from one side of the composition to the other side to give a sense of kind of movement. And I'm going to isolate the background so that I can just work on the background on its own. You can see here we've got these little eye symbols, just like in Photoshop, to turn our layers off. And I'm going to go to the sky layer there. We have a tool panel up here, and this is our move tool or selection tool. So if I grab the selection tool and have that layer selected, just like in Photoshop, although spatially a little bit arranged a little bit differently, I can move that object around in space. Okay, so what we essentially want to do is to, at the start of the animation, place our image here, and then as we move through time, we can move that bit of artwork across the page and get the effect of movement. So let's move our image over here, and our timeline indicator will be set to 0. Okay, so right at the start of the animation, let's make sure we've got the sky selected, and then there's these little tiny arrows to the left here. Twirl that down and we can see our transformation options. Let's twirl down the transformation options. Gives a little bit more space here. Here we can see all of the transformations that we can animate over time. And we're going to focus in these animations on position, scale, rotation, and opacity. For our sky, we're going to rotate the position property. Okay, so with our timeline indicator set to 0, let's add what we call a keyframe. Getting the hang of keyframes is really the crux of After Effects. We add a keyframe by selecting the little stopwatch here. So for position, I'm going to click that keyframe there. And you can see it's sort of slightly changed. We now have a little icon over there to the left, and we've added a keyframe to the timeline. Alright, so that kind of denotes a particular kind of set of variables in time. Let's move right across to the 10-second mark. Okay, and we can do a couple of things here to add our second keyframe. So an animation needs 2 keyframes at least, a starting keyframe and a keyframe at the end of the animation. If I move, because I've moved my timeline indicator right to the end of the animation there, if I move this piece of artwork or layer over to the left, I'm just going to hold Shift down when I do that so that it constrains it, and then let go. You can see that it's automatically created a second keyframe for me in the timeline. You can also see here an animation path over in our canvas there. So when I now move my timeline indicator across the timeline, you can see that we've created that animation. To watch that animation play, what we need to do is hit the spacebar on the keyboard, and that will cause our animation to play like so. Now yours might not go into full screen because it's the preview panel. Because I've made a change in my preview panel over here, I've set it to full screen. But I might not do that for, I'll uncheck that and close that panel. So now when I hit the spacebar, it'll just play in situ, which is good. So there we have it. That's our first animation, and I might take a break here and we'll start another video to really get into our animation process.